It's June 4th, 1942. The waves of the Pacific glisten under a pale morning sun, but above them, the sky is alive with fire and chaos. Just 6 months have passed since Japan's stunning triumph at Pearl Harbor, a victory so overwhelming that it convinced an entire empire that destiny itself was on their side. But now, aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands paralyzed on the command deck. The rumble of explosions echoes across the horizon as American dive bombers plummet through the clouds in near vertical descents, their engines screaming like banshees. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, will be consumed by infernos so violent they'll light the ocean surface. And with them will sink not just hundreds of planes and thousands of men, but the illusion of Japan's invincibility. Midway will not merely be a battle. It will be the moment Japan's high command realizes that Pearl Harbor was never the beginning of an empire. It was the beginning of its end. To understand how Japan's seemingly unstoppable rise unraveled so completely, we have to turn back the clock to that fateful Sunday morning of December 7th, 1941, and examine the fatal flaws embedded within Japan's grand war strategy. That morning, when the first Japanese bombers appeared over Oahu, the world changed in an instant. The attack was executed with near-perfect precision, 353 aircraft roaring out of the dawn, striking America's Pacific Fleet as it lay unsuspecting in the calm waters of Pearl Harbor. In just 2 hours, 8 U.S. battleships were sunk or crippled, hundreds of aircraft lay smoldering on the airfields, and over 2,000 Americans were dead. It was, on the surface, a military masterpiece. Lightning fast, devastatingly effective and brilliantly coordinated. Back in Tokyo, military leaders were euphoric. Newspapers heralded the strike as a triumph that would change the course of history. Across Japan, crowds filled the streets, cheering the Imperial Navy and hailing Admiral Yamamoto's genius. It seemed at that moment as though the rising sun truly had no equal. The plan appeared foolproof, cripple America's Pacific Fleet so thoroughly that Washington would have no choice but to negotiate. The Japanese leadership believed that with the U.S. temporarily paralyzed, they could sweep across Southeast Asia, seize vital resources in the Dutch East Indies, and fortify their new empire with a ring of island strongholds impossible to breach. By the time America recovered, Japan's defensive perimeter would be unassailable. But what Japan's war cabinet fatally misjudged was not America's navy. It was America's soul. They assumed the shock of Pearl Harbor would break American resolve. Instead, it fused an entire nation together with a single burning purpose: revenge. The sleeping giant had indeed been awakened, and its fury would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood this better than anyone. And like many of his fellow officers, he had lived in the United States. He'd studied at Harvard, toured its cities and factories, and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had seen America's vast industrial might with his own eyes and understood its people in ways his peers did not. Yamamoto knew that once the U.S. was provoked, its citizens would not seek compromise. They would demand total victory. Before launching the attack, he gave a grim warning to his superiors. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." But amid the celebrations following Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's warning was dismissed as pessimism. In those early months of the war, victory seemed inevitable. American battleships lay twisted and burning on the harbor floor, and Japan's empire was expanding faster than anyone thought possible. Yet beneath the surface of that apparent triumph were 3 catastrophic errors, oversights so severe that they ensured Japan's doom long before Midway. The first was the most obvious: the attack completely missed America's aircraft carriers. When the bombs fell, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all away at sea. These ships, not the battleships, would become the true backbone of American naval power. The second mistake was leaving Pearl Harbor's critical infrastructure untouched. The fuel depots, dry docks, and submarine bases all were spared. That meant the U.S. could repair, refuel, and regroup far faster than Japan's planners had ever imagined. The third, and perhaps most disastrous, was underestimating America's industrial capacity, the one weapon no fleet could sink. In 1941, America's economy was a sleeping colossus. Its factories were still running at peacetime tempo, its workforce not yet fully mobilized. But once awakened, that machine could produce at a scale no other nation could match. U.S. steel output was 7 times greater than Japan's. American oil production exceeded Japan's by more than 100-fold. Its industrial base was 10 times larger, and its population nearly double. Those numbers alone told a story of inevitability, but the real miracle was in how swiftly that potential was transformed into power. By early 1942, American shipyards that once required years to build a single warship were launching new vessels every few weeks. Airplane factories that had produced a few dozen planes per month were now manufacturing thousands. Automakers turned assembly lines once dedicated to family cars into factories for tanks, bombers, and jeeps. And far from bogging down production, America's democracy accelerated it. Private companies competed to outdo each other in innovation and efficiency. The result was the most staggering industrial mobilization in human history. Meanwhile, Japan's war machine was already straining. Each ship and aircraft lost was a precious asset, difficult to replace due to resource shortages and limited manufacturing capacity. Japan's leaders had assumed their early victories in places like the Philippines, Malaya, and Singapore would guarantee long-term security. Yet beneath the surface of their expansion, a quiet reversal had already begun. As Japan celebrated conquest after conquest, American codebreakers were busy shattering Japan's naval encryption. At a nondescript building in Pearl Harbor known as Station Hypo, cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort painstakingly pieced together Japanese communications until they uncovered something extraordinary: the entire Japanese plan for the next major offensive. This intelligence coup would give Admiral Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, an advantage no admiral in history had ever possessed: foreknowledge of the enemy's strategy, the timing, and exact location. By June 1942, Yamamoto was preparing to deliver the final blow. His plan was elegant on paper: lure out America's surviving carriers by threatening Midway Atoll, annihilate them in a decisive battle, and restore Japan's dominance at sea. To ensure success, he even staged a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, hoping to draw U.S. forces north. It was a complex chess game across thousands of miles of ocean, one requiring flawless coordination. But Yamamoto was unaware that every move of his fleet was being watched. When the Japanese strike force approached Midway, Nimitz had already positioned his 3 carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, exactly where they needed to be. On the morning of June 4th, as Japanese aircraft bombarded Midway's defenses, American squadrons took to the air, flying into what would become one of the most dramatic and costly aerial duels of the war. The first waves of American torpedo bombers met disaster. Outdated and slow, flying low over open water, they were easy prey for Japanese Zero fighters. Entire squadrons were wiped out in minutes. Crews vanished into the sea without scoring a single hit. Yet their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Those doomed attacks drew Japanese fighters down to sea level and scattered their defensive formation, leaving the skies above the fleet exposed. Moments later, from 14,000 feet, a formation of American dive bombers appeared through a break in the clouds, an unexpected arrival that would change history in less than 5 minutes. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, their decks cluttered with fueled and armed aircraft preparing for another strike, were caught completely off guard. The bombers dived almost vertically, their sirens wailing, releasing bombs that smashed directly into the carrier's decks. One by one, the great ships erupted into pillars of fire. When the smoke cleared, Japan's elite naval air arm, the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, was gone. The Empire's strategic initiative vanished with it. From that day forward, Japan would fight a defensive war it could never hope to win. Midway was more than a battle. It was a reckoning. It exposed the fatal arrogance at the heart of Japan's wartime leadership, the belief that courage and precision could substitute for industrial strength and strategic patience. It proved that a democracy, once provoked, could wage war with the ferocity of any empire. And it marked the moment when the Pacific shifted, permanently, in America's favor. The fire that consumed the Akagi. That June morning didn't just burn steel and oil. It burned away the illusion of Japan's invulnerability. The sleeping giant Yamamoto had warned about was now fully awake, and from Midway onward, the tide of history would move only one way. Aboard the Japanese carriers that fateful morning of June 4th, 1942, there existed a fleeting moment of relief, a fragile illusion that all was still within control. The American assault against Midway Island had been repelled, at least temporarily. From the bridge of the Akagi and the deck of the Kaga, officers surveyed the aftermath of the opening waves, taking note of the burned-out craters and smoldering wreckage ashore. Within the Japanese fleet, mechanics and deck crews hustled across the decks, refueling and rearming planes, patching minor damage, and preparing for a counterattack that would, they believed, decisively crush the American forces. There was a collective breath held among sailors and pilots alike, a sense that their meticulous planning was still yielding results. Success at that moment still seemed tantalizingly within reach. The carriers, resplendent with their sleek aircraft lined on deck, projected the image of unstoppable power. Then, at precisely 10:25 a.m., reality crashed down like a hammer of fate. American dive bombers launched from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet with an almost miraculous timing that would be forever remembered as one of the decisive strokes of fortune in military history. They pierced through small gaps in the Japanese fighter screen, appearing over the decks of the carriers with near-perfect synchronization. The Japanese defensive formations, so meticulously prepared to repel assaults, were suddenly incomplete, misaligned, and fatally exposed. At that moment, the carriers' decks, crammed with fully armed and fueled aircraft ready to launch for another offensive wave, became death traps. In the span of mere minutes, the Akagi, Kagai, and Soryu, once symbols of Japan's naval supremacy, were engulfed in roaring infernos. The fires leapt skyward, consuming wooden flight decks, gasoline stores, and torpedoes. The wails of trapped crew, the shouts of officers attempting to coordinate damage control, and the deafening explosions of fuel and munitions created a chaotic symphony of destruction. Sailors threw themselves into the waters to escape the flames, while firefighters and emergency teams worked frantically to halt the uncontrollable blazes. Yet within 5 minutes it was hopeless. 3 carriers, each a floating fortress of Japanese naval power, were effectively destroyed. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, would not escape the day's devastation. Later that afternoon, U.S. dive bombers located and struck her with precision, setting her ablaze and sealing the fate of Japan's central carrier force. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had orchestrated the brilliant and devastating attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months prior, could do nothing but watch in stunned disbelief as his pride, his command, and the hope of a decisive victory in the Pacific dissolved in smoke and fire. The man who had once walked triumphantly over the decks of Pearl Harbor's conquest now stood paralyzed, a witness to the annihilation of the very fleet he had once led to glory. These vessels were not mere ships. They were repositories of irreplaceable skill, experience, and knowledge. Within their steel hulls and across their flight decks were housed Japan's most skilled aviators, mechanics, flight deck crews, and operational planners. These were men whose expertise had been honed over years of rigorous training, countless exercises and wartime sorties. The air wings aboard these carriers embodied battle experience that could never be recreated, no matter how many replacement carriers Japan might hastily construct. The death toll at Midway exceeded 2,000 sailors and aviators, a human tragedy compounded by a strategic calamity. Japan had entered the war with 10 fleet carriers. After Midway, 4 remained, while 3 lay shattered at the ocean floor and 1 would be permanently damaged. For America, however, this was the dawn of an industrial juggernaut just beginning to flex its muscles. The massive carrier-building program, already underway in stateside shipyards, meant that losses at sea were no match for the factories lining the coasts. Yamamoto's greatest fear, the overwhelming industrial power of the United States, was unfolding in real time. The stark realization of error rippled through the Japanese naval headquarters like ice water. Admirals who had toasted Pearl Harbor now faced the horrifying clarity of Midway. They had launched a war that, from a strategic standpoint, they could not possibly win. Pearl Harbor had failed in its central purpose. It had not removed America from the conflict. It had not struck the carriers that would determine the outcome of future naval engagements. It had not crippled repair facilities, fuel depots, or the industrial infrastructure that would allow the United States to recover with astonishing speed. In its wake, it had galvanized a nation, united public sentiment, and guaranteed American engagement with a focus and intensity Japan could never counter. Every assumption that had justified the attack, about American resolve, democratic inefficiency, and the fragility of industrial production, had been shattered. The truth of Midway now lay bare. Japan's tactical brilliance had led to strategic catastrophe. The numbers were stark, merciless, and undeniable. Even if Japan continued to win battles in the months that followed, the sheer scale of American industrial capacity rendered ultimate victory impossible. Fleet carriers were being built faster than Japan could hope to match. Submarines and air power were strangling Japanese supply lines, cutting off vital oil, rubber, and metals that were the lifeblood of the empire's war machine. Aircraft factories in the United States were producing unprecedented quantities of fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. The gap in production was widening every week, every month. It was a brutal mathematical truth. Japan's fate had been sealed by the inexorable laws of industrial capacity. Yet recognition of an impending defeat and the acceptance of it are profoundly different psychological hurdles. Despite the disaster at Midway and mounting evidence that the war could not be won, Japanese leadership pressed forward with relentless tenacity. The code of Bushido, which enshrined honor, loyalty, and the refusal to yield, intertwined with institutional inertia, created a situation where logical reassessment was impossible. Instead of seeking negotiation while still controlling substantial territories, the Japanese military doubled down. They fortified defensive positions, launched desperate offensives across the Pacific, and initiated campaigns in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and beyond, operations that would claim hundreds of thousands of additional lives over the next 3 years. Each effort, however daring or meticulously executed, was ultimately a prolongation of the inevitable, a war of attrition fought against insurmountable odds. Viewed in hindsight, Pearl Harbor is revealed as one of history's great strategic miscalculations. It achieved tactical surprise and inflicted temporary damage, but every strategic objective failed catastrophically. America's entry into the war was not delayed, nor was its industrial might diminished. American sea power was not crippled. Critical infrastructure remained intact, and the time Japan believed it had bought to fortify its empire was illusory. Instead, Pearl Harbor set in motion a chain of events, culminating in the catastrophic loss at Midway, the progressive erosion of Japanese naval dominance, and ultimately, the inexorable march of Allied forces toward Japan itself. Admiral Yamamoto's foresight had been tragically prescient. He understood the danger, understood the capabilities of his adversary, and yet he was constrained by political imperatives, national pride, and the momentum of military planning that could not be stopped. Leaders around him preferred comforting allusions to the harsh truth that the United States, once provoked, would harness its democracy, industrial power and human spirit in a way that no single strike could ever contain. The story of Pearl Harbor and its Midway consequences transcends mere history. It serves as a timeless lesson in strategic planning, in understanding adversaries, and in the fatal consequences of wishful thinking. Japanese leaders had hoped Americans lacked resolve, hoped factories could not be mobilized, hoped one spectacular attack would achieve objectives that required years of sustained superiority. When those hopes were shattered, Japan had no contingency other than doubling down on a doomed course. Compounding loss after loss, modern military theorists, political strategists, and historians study Pearl Harbor and Midway not merely for the drama of battle, but for the insight it provides into human judgment, cultural misperception, and the unforgiving arithmetic of industrial power. The recognition of error at Midway arrived 6 months too late to prevent war, yet 3 years too soon to avert hundreds of thousands of additional deaths. By the end of the Pacific conflict, the lesson would be unambiguous. No amount of courage, training, or audacity could overcome the immutable combination of industrial might, strategic foresight, and national resolve. The sleeping giant Yamamoto had warned of was fully awake, and Midway had proven that once stirred, it would not be appeased until victory was absolute.